What's up, guys? On today's episode, we're going to be closing up the interior walls and much more, so stay tuned. So I started off with something I finished in the last episode. I wrapped the perimeter of the back wall paneling with some molding just to create a finished look. So before I could get to cutting any of the interior paneling, I realized that I didn't have anything to screw or nail the corner sections up with. There was just no stud there, just the way I framed out the wall. So I decided to cut some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood and screw them up flush with the side walls, so I had something to nail into. So I made the last minute decision to use 1/2 inch plywood to cover all the walls, to support the paneling a little bit better in case something knocked into it while we were driving. It also gave me a secure backer to screw into if I wasn't over a stud and wanted to add something to the walls later. So at this point, we decided to do some real scientific stuff here and decide on the exterior bar top height. Basically, we picked a height between what we could reach from the inside, we meaning Gabby, and a height that would be comfortable for people outside to rest their drink on. So now that we determined the height of the bar top, I decided to make the brackets to hold the bar top to the outside of the trailer. Big shout out to my neighbor Eddie for giving me this bandsaw. It was a huge help. Also, a side note, these purple strip discs are awesome for taking rust off and removing paint. So to make these brackets a little bit cleaner and less blocky looking, I decided to cut the ends on an angle. If I was smart, I could have put them both together like that, and then just cut them together, and they would have been perfect matches to each other.
Dobie.
That's not nice.
Oh, well, you said it has to be nice. Now I'll just sit here in the back of your video.
So next up, I cut 2 1/8 inch pieces of plate and drilled 2 holes that'll ultimately be welded to the arms that I just cut, giving me a surface to bolt to the side of the trailer. So for this particular job, I decided to TIG weld it just because typically TIG welding, your welds come out a lot cleaner and flatter and ultimately require less grinding, if any at all. One other thing you notice me doing here is I put a series of small tacks before fully welding it, making sure to check square each time, because as you heat an area of the part, it'll actually shrink and pull it out of square as you move around a tube or any shape for that matter. So like every other hole that I drilled in this aluminum skin, I was very careful to mark everything square and in the right spot, made sure there was nothing behind it, because I really didn't want to put any unnecessary holes in the outside of this thing after I just sealed it up. So because the brackets for the outdoor bar fell where there was no studs or anything, and I didn't want to just bolt it to the 1/2-inch plywood that I was putting on the inside, I decided to build a block out of 2x4, put a couple pocket holes in it, and screw it to either stud on either side of the bracket to make it stronger and prevent it from pulling out. So the rear backing support actually needed to be modified a little bit because there was only one stud to the left. To the right, there was just the metal frame of the trailer, and I didn't want to screw into that. So you can see here, I just did a similar thing and only utilized one stud. It was still plenty strong. So because we had some downtime from the rain, I decided to cap off these brackets. Basically, I just used the cloth tape to get the overall measurement from the top to the bottom of the tube, including the angle, and then I cut a flat piece of plate again and welded it over the front half, capping it off. So even though I was happy with the way the welds came out on these cover pieces, I decided to grind them smooth just to make them a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance. We're going to skip around a lot here just because we were coming up to the start of the party season. It was getting warmer and we were trying to jam and get this thing done as quickly as possible. And we had a launch event planned for May 22nd, which we ended up hitting, but the filming suffered a little bit and I'm sorry. So as you can see, I'm just unboxing the Vanity that we bought. It's just a cheap big box store unit. Ultimately, I think I'm going to end up replacing this with like a nice stainless sink here for washing your hands, as well as a separate stainless steel sink just to rinse dishes and stuff like that while we're at a party. So this sink ended up being the perfect size. I did take this measurement prior to going to the store, but it worked out really well that it didn't block the door at all and you weren't going to be bumping into it every time you were going in and out of the trailer. So rather than installing the sink basin first and then trying to mess with the faucet and the drain, I ended up assembling the whole thing on top of the freezer, and then I siliconed and dropped it right onto its base, making this process very easy. So back to the brackets that I made earlier, I ended up priming and painting these white to match the outside of the trailer, and then before I bolted them in with carriage bolts, I put silicone on the back face of the mounting surface to keep water from getting inside the trailer and rotting the wood. All in all, I'm really happy with the way this came out. So this next item that we're taking care of is the gas struts on the side window. This is something I was really excited to do because up until this point, we were using a wood board just to hold it open, and it was kind of dangerous and it just looked like crap and we never really got a good picture. But first, of course, as with most Saturdays, fix the tractor. So for these gas struts, I used a calculator online that gave you measurements and the strength of the gas struts you were supposed to use. Either my measurements were wrong or something was heavier than I thought. It didn't work and it took a little bit of trial and error, but ultimately we figured it out. So I ended up having this RV water pump lying around from my parents' previous camper. It was never used because they typically hooked up to city water rather than bringing water with them in the tank. So I ended up wiring this in with a laptop transformer. I spec'd it to match the amperage output on the pump, and honestly, it's been working great since I've done it. You won't see it in this video because I ended up drilling a hole through the back of the transformer when I was mounting it by accident, but it works great. So while I finished cutting the plywood for the walls, now that I had the outdoor bar brackets up, Gabby repainted the ceiling because when we did it the first time, it ended up getting cold at night and it caused the paint to flake off in certain areas that were a little bit thicker than other areas. I don't know why it happened. I've never seen it happen before, but I've also never painted when it was getting down to freezing temperatures. So that's a little tip. Wake up. Baby, all the stuff. So now that I finally have all the plywood up on the interior walls, I got to cutting the beadboard paneling and nailing that up next. So that we can look at them all night. Just keep holding me, don't let me go. Everything's so magical. All I need is you tonight. If I shut my eyes, keeping them closed, all the senses explodes. You Can't believe what a big difference this paneling made.
Didn't waste our time, didn't sleep as much as now. Let's stay up all night.
So to finish off the interior corners of the paneling, I cut a piece of white trim board on a 45 and then just nailed it up in the corner. So for the front corners, I cut this other piece of trim board with a little recessed edge to cover the edge of the plywood and the edge of the paneling, and to meet up with the metal, so it created a clean finished look. So next up, I put some basic floor trim to cover the gap between the floor and the paneling. And one thing that might be a little hard to see in this, I ended up having to box out around the outlet because the depth of the trailer wall was too shallow and the outlet stuck out of the wall.
Just keep holding me, don't let me go, making it so magical. All I need is you to
So one minor but important item, I cut little blocks and screwed them into the floor on all four sides, keep the keezer from sliding around while we drove. With the keezer all secured to the floor, I decided to wrap the collar with pallet wood, as well as the framing for the bar. Every time I do this pallet wood, it's such a mess. The next thing I jumped into was actually cutting a piece of masonite for the chalkboard that would function as a menu on the door. So as you can see, I added some wooden framing to the inside of the doors so that I could mount the masonite up that I would paint with chalkboard paint in the future. In addition, I got a good picture at night with all the pallet wood finished on the front of the bar and the front of the keezer. So one minor but important thing, I added the door stops to hold the doors open prior to putting the chalkboard on, and Gabby came up with this great idea of using the greenery to cover the walls on the inside to give it a little more color.
no, let's not waste our time.
So after 9 long months of working on this thing, it's finally done. So it's crazy to see how far this project has come from the beginning. Definitely had its ups and downs, but all in all, it was very rewarding. That's it for this episode, guys. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.